convergence, which you will see in your program. We are scheduled to go from 9 a.m. to 12 noon, so I must apologize for starting 10 minutes late, and I hope that we can make up the time as we go along so that we can finish at 12 noon to preserve the integrity of the program for the rest of the day. The first item there you will have the presenters, Professor Jessica Byron, who is Professor and Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. She will deliver the keynote address for this panel, and then we're going to have with her the CSME, a reply to the Golding Report by Colin Constantine, who's a PhD student in the Department of Economics at Kingston University in London in the United Kingdom. Then we're going to have findings of the Forum on the Future of the Caribbean by Carlos Elias, who's an adjunct professor of economics at Radford University in the United States. Then there's a switch between numbers 4 and 5. The Professor of Practice, Professor Winston Dukaran, at the Institute of International Relations is going to go last, and so that 5 becomes 4 and 4 becomes 5. So that in the fourth spot will be Brazilian integration. Is the convergence process taking root by Jennifer Sobotka, who is Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Radford University, USA. And then the final topic will be regionalism in the Caribbean is economic convergence, a new frontier by Winston Dukaran. Now, everyone has approximately 25 minutes, so once we start at 10 past 9, that's about 205 minutes. It's going to take us until about 11:15, and we'll then have 45 minutes of discussion time, and I'd like to be able to finish at 12 noon to preserve the integrity of the program. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Jessica Byron to deliver the keynote address on Pan-Caribbean integration. Professor Byron.
Thank you very much, Hamid. Keynote address sounds a little bit pretentious. This is a presentation like all the others. Now, the text, wait, hold on, let me just make sure I get this right. Now, where do I point to? Huh? Yes, nice. The text, let me go to the next one. Right. Just so we remember what our region looks like. The text, I wanted to start by speaking first of all about an edited text that 2 colleagues from the Mona campus and myself published last January 2018, Pan-Caribbean Regionalism, Beyond CARICOM. Now the text Pan-Caribbean Regionalism is one of the outcomes of a Salises conference that was held way back in 2013 to commemorate the 40th anniversary of CARICOM. And the editors of the book and all who were also the organizers of that conference were members of a Salises research cluster on regional integration that was led by Professor Patsy Lewis. So I'll speak about the book, and then in the second part of the presentation, I want to reflect a little bit on the current debates on regionalism and the challenges facing Caribbean and Latin American integration or even cooperation, even though these remain imperatives for addressing the Sustainable Development Goals and policy dilemmas that face this hemisphere. So in our text, no, that was great. Right. We wish to push the understandings of regional cooperation and integration beyond CARICOM and to explore that grouping within its wider ecosystem. We felt that the integration project needed new sources of inspiration and energy. And so the anniversary provided us with the opportunity to reflect on how to expand and invigorate Caribbean regionalism in terms of the engagement of states and territories, other non-state actors, and how to tap into new resources and innovative ideas. The book explores CARICOM's own role in advancing Pan-Caribbean regionalism, and it examines the impact of widening relations on the Caribbean community itself, on the evolution of South-South cooperation in the Caribbean, and on political and institutional changes that have taken place in the non-independent territories in the region. The book is dedicated to Norman Gervin, another committed Caribbean regionalist. Norman was one of the keynote speakers at that conference, and it turned out to be one of his very last public presentations. I just want to mention briefly the editorial challenges. They were exciting, they were stimulating, but there were challenges in pulling together a text that is written by authors from several linguistic backgrounds and several university or non-university backgrounds, because we also brought in the work of advocates and advocates of Caribbean regionalism. The cost of translation and interpretation would have been considerable had the editorial team itself not done the lion's share of translating. I want to mention, in addition to what I did and what Terry Ann Gilbert Roberts did, Jacqueline LaGuardia did some translated 2 of the Cuban presentations and so on. So I'm saying that to emphasize that when we are working pan-Caribbean, we are working across linguistic spheres, across philosophical spheres, and it takes us into new and exciting and challenging terrain. The editors provide the introductory context in this text with a retrospective analysis of the international and regional events of the 80s and 90s, which stimulated the widening dynamics within CARICOM and between member states and their contiguous non-CARICOM neighbors. This is followed by a wide-ranging reflection by Gervin on the social and political thought and actions which underpin constructions of the Caribbean. In broad strokes, he travels from indigenous settlements and imperial rivalries to 3 categories of thinkers. The Pan-Africanist ones, Garvey, Rodney, for example, the revolutionary pan-Caribbean thinkers, such as Haitian Antenor Fermat and Thomas, Trinidadian, and C.L.R. James, and the plantation pan-Caribbeanists, led of course by Eric Williams and the New World thinkers. And finally, to the concept and the institutions of the Greater Caribbean that began to be constructed in the 1990s. Gervin concludes that culture holds the key to wider Caribbean integration. And I'm sure you will all agree if you attended any of the magnificent Carifesta events that we enjoyed 2 weeks ago. And he underlines the role and responsibilities of universities in helping to make that potential materialize. There is also a chapter by Percy Hinson on post-colonialism and Caribbean regionalism. Section 2 focuses on the non-independent territories in the region. Begins with a comparative study by Patsy Lewis and myself of the diverse modalities and rules for their associate membership in CARICOM, the OECS, and the ACS, and the contributions they have made to and benefits they have derived from these organizations. Subsequent chapters by French Caribbean authors, Gali, Petit, and Renaud, give their perspectives on the experience of Martinique in pursuing greater autonomy through regional cooperation, on contemporary French foreign policy in the Caribbean and the phenomenon of territorial diplomacy, and finally, on the significance of regional universities in either fanning the flames of insularity or promoting regional knowledge, greater regional knowledge and awareness. Section 3 brings a variety of perspectives on Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which highlights some key challenges both for CARICOM and for pan-Caribbean integration. Sabine Manigat muses on Haiti's continued solitude and stigmatization on issues like migration, characterizing the relationship with CARICOM as one of fascination, mistrust, and mutual ignorance. She underlines the deep differences in diplomatic practice, in understandings of national interest, and in concepts of human rights between CARICOM and its newest member. Gloria Amezquita explores contrasting perspectives within Dominican Republic society on the Constitutional Court judgment, TD 16813, that had the potential to strip citizenship from up to 200,000 of its nationals of Haitian ancestry. Presenting 2 case studies, she uses media content analysis and discourse analysis to lay bare the identity politics and the power struggles in the Dominican Republic. And she focuses on citizenship and human rights dimensions, institutionalized racism, and the important roles that were played by regional and international actors in this ongoing human drama. Finally, Bernard Phipps debates whether French or Creole should be CARICOM's second official language. He highlights the politics of language and the mutual linguistic indifference of Caribbean people towards one another. And he makes a case for the inclusion of Creole as a way to affirm grassroots identity and democracy in the Caribbean community. Part 4, Part 4 presents the perspectives of 3 Cuban authors on Cuba's engagement with CARICOM and on CARICOM countries developing engagements with Latin America. They mention Cuba's evolving approaches to development cooperation with Caribbean states, its South-South and triangular cooperation in the region. Piedras discusses the pros and cons of CARICOM's deepening pragmatic engagement with Latin American regionalism. And he argues that CARICOM's policy coordination and group unity works to its advantage as a group of very small actors within the wider space. Romero's paper was written at a time when ALBA, Petrocaribe, and CELAC were all functional, not yet stymied by political and economic crises. And he explores the convergence of interests between Caribbean and Latin American countries in a wide range of developmental areas, and analyzes ways in which such convergence could be capitalized on within the frameworks of the new cooperation machinery. Finally, in Part 5, Alister Trotz dwells on diaspora and its relevance to the regional integration projects, prospecting for ways to strengthen national and regional approaches to engage with Caribbean diasporas. I want to mention that Trotz also raises the issue of gender and Caribbean regionalism. She points to the significance of the CCJ judgment in the case that was brought by Shanique Myrie concerning the right to mobility of all CARICOM citizens within the regional space. And she also raises the importance of women, members of the diaspora, in remittances and in supporting societies back at home, their role in regional development. Montout and Abdenour survey the engagement of Brazil, India, and China with CARICOM countries, exposing the significant differences in the geopolitical interests of these 3 emerging powers, which translate into the way that they implement SSC with regional countries and groups. And they conclude that CARICOM must formulate more coherent cooperation policies rooted in a longer-term development vision rather than focus on short-term gains if the region is to maximize the benefits that are available in this new age of choice. So the collection was wrapped up with a 2017 analysis by the authors, the editors of the shifting economic, political, and geopolitical environment in which regional and national policies and relationships were evolving. Brexit and the European Union, the Trump era in the United States, crises in Brazil, Venezuela, and other parts of Latin America, and Mexico's rapprochement to CARICOM and the ACS. The crises and uncertainties of Caribbean regionalism since 2009 will no doubt be analyzed in greater detail by my fellow panelists. They mirror the larger crises and uncertainties in Latin America and the global environment at the present time. I want to emphasize that despite the shortcomings that we all perceive in CARICOM, the OECS, and the ACS, Ironically, they remain three of the more stable and functional examples of regional governance in this hemisphere. NAFTA, UNASUR, Mercosur, the Andean Community, the Central American Community, CELAC, not to mention ALBA and Petrocaribe, have all at best been weakened, at worst paralyzed by domestic political and economic conflicts which have polarized their membership and incapacitated regional governance structures. The European Union, major example of the furthest reaches of regional governance, grapples with its own internal crises, captured in the ongoing drama of Brexit, but also it grapples with tectonic shifts in national and regional politics and the hard dilemmas that are posed by migration, sustainable development, global competition, fiscal prudence and economic austerity, and citizen expectations, just to mention a few. What do I draw from contemporary discourses on regionalism? Scholars of regionalism will point out that periods of pessimism are not new. The field is characterized by cyclical highs and lows in its theoretical evolution, its academic and policy attractiveness, and its related praxis. In fact, theorizing on regional integration or cooperation, and of course there's a difference between those two terms, in the 21st century has been prolific and has thrown up many innovative concepts and ideas, as well as burning debates. A good read for a wide-ranging survey is the Oxford Handbook on Regionalism, which was published in 2016. And I want to just mention in that collection Amitav Acharya's deepening of his early propositions about regionalism in the non-European world. He argues that post-colonial regionalism, arising out of the historical circumstances of the actors, is a quest to strengthen autonomy and preserve sovereignty. And so he argues for a new theory of post-colonial regionalism, which he says should privilege cooperation over integration and should prioritize developmental regional processes and activities. Of course, a preoccupation with developmental regionalism has characterized our own experiences and experiments in the Caribbean. It should focus on less formally institutionalized processes which would not be perceived as threats to sovereignty. He argues that spillover under these circumstances should start with political will and cooperation practices rather than with economic logics. Although Acharya provides an excellent survey of the different currents of regional theorizing, one could argue that this latter proposition is too facile, and it sweeps under the carpet some harsh realities about constructing sustainable regional institutions and building their capacity. I would tend to agree with Mary Farrell, 2005, that sustainable regionalism still requires a material economic base to drive cooperation. However, Acharya's ideas, published in 2014 and 2017, about the evolution of and the potential roles for regional blocs as the global liberal order crumbles, they invite further reflection and exploration. Now, in Latin America, a debate has raged in recent years between Pia Rigirozzi and Diana Tussi's writing in 2012, 2015, optimistic and then more sober explorations of a concept called post-hegemonic developmental regionalism. Their writings were based on developments between 2005, roughly, and 2012, mostly involving UNASUR in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the countervailing arguments have been put by Gardini and Malamud's argument in 2012 that Latin America's regionalist wave had reached its peak and would probably recede due to excessive fragmentation and ideological polarization. Notably, however, Gardini and Malamud were not, frankly, they couldn't care less about the Caribbean. They were concerned with South America. They contended that while regionalism had limited economic strategic value for several South American states, it retained significance for foreign policy coordination that could increase international visibility and regional stability. What is that? Nothing to do with us? Okay. I thought it was your doing. This idea is endorsed by Gilbert Roberts, 2015,
Morning.
who signaled the value of regional
Hello, how are you?
processes
I'm good.
like CARICOM and CELAC in SDG agenda setting and implementation strategies. Now, I want to refer finally to the social constructivists. Social constructivist perspectives on shared values and community building have added value to our understanding of regionalism from within the European Union itself to many other places, including in the Caribbean and Latin America. Thomas Muir, in 2015, proposes that a regional space is not merely geographic and static, but is dynamic, relational, and socially constructed. He was actually writing with reference to Alba. Arguably, Norman Govan was also tapping into such constructivist ideas back in the early 2000s as he strategized on the possibilities for the Greater Caribbean and later for CARICOM. I want to finally refer to a publication by Rebecca Adler-Nissen in 2014. Her text was entitled Opting Out of the EU, Diplomacy, Sovereignty, and European Integration. She revisited the concept of variable geometry, which we refer to sometimes in CARICOM in various ways. And she was arguing that the latter, combined with pragmatism, are the trends of the future to hold regions together. Most regional groupings are severely taxed at present. She urges more focus on social processes, on diplomacy, and on the negotiation of difference, rather than an all-encompassing preoccupation with institution building. I think all of these themes will stay with us throughout this panel and into the next panel this afternoon when we are speaking about diplomacy in a new global context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Byron, for that keynote address that will launch this particular panel. The next presenter is Colin Constantine, who is a PhD student in the Department of Economics at Kingston University in London in the United Kingdom, and his topic is Wither CSME, a reply to the Golding Report. Colin Constantine.
Hello, morning. Let me just ensure that great, and I can point. So, great. All right. So, I'm just going to get into it. So last year, deep in my own work, popped out the Golden Report, and there was some excitement in Jamaica at Mona campus. They had a little presentation, and I had a read of the report. And I felt compelled to write a reply. So just a bit background story. So my dissertation looks at the Eurozone crisis. Yeah? So intra-Eurozone imbalances is key. And I focus a lot on asymmetries, and hence the compulsion. Now I'm going to try to do justice to the Golden Report. You can have a read for yourself. All right, so the key thesis of the report is this. There is a Jamaican ultimatum. 5 years to have the CSME as intended, or fully functional, as they say, or the threat a Jamaican exit, with membership of CARICOM, of course, to be retained. The key contention of the report is that they're annoyed of Trinidad and Tobago's pricing of oil and Jamaica's inability, because of the common external tariff, to source cheaper energy from extra markets. But there's a potential contradiction, and I'll highlight the quotes in the following slides. They make the point that cheaper energy sources will not necessarily improve businesses' cost effectiveness. They can't have it both ways. Now, the point of the report, as part of the terms of reference, is to analyze, serious analysis, as to how CARICOM affects Jamaica's economic performance. There was no such analysis in the report. There were two charts, one dealing with social economic statistics for Jamaica, and of course they're depressing, I concede, right? But we need serious analysis. Then they focus on the implementation deficit as for the reason why in the integration process is stalled. The bureaucratic inertia is the fundamental only reason according to the report, and I'm going to argue in slides to follow that they ignore foundational symmetries. Finally, if you're going to make the case for a fully functional CSME in 5 years, then I would expect the report to make a strong case for the CSME, but they fail to do so either in terms of the aggregate gains from full integration or distributive gains from full integration. I'm sorry, this is not working. Great. All right. So the pricing of energy story, very quickly, because we should be familiar with that here. So the argument is that Trinidadian firms benefit from a kind of implicit subsidy here in Trinidad, and it's a competitive disadvantage for Jamaican firms. They also complain about non-tariff barriers being imposed on their exports to this market. Now, but then they highlight other constraints, and this is what I think is a major contradiction, highlight in bold here. But failures of Jamaica has to do with domestic choices, not these CARICOM-specific constraints. Then they say not to be blamed by membership or the non-implementation of critical CSME provisions. So what is it really? Is the problem with Jamaica related to Jamaican problems or CARICOM-specific problems? The implementation deficit. Much of the report deals with the implementation deficit. They have a lot to say about bureaucratic inertia and several reform ideas at the level of CARICOM. So they argue, and quite sensibly I think, that there is separation of responsibility and accountability at CARICOM. And by the way, many of these ideas are well known from the Time of Action report, West Indian Commission, the Linda Mills Commission and so forth. Many of the ideas are rehashed here, so these are not necessarily new. Inadequate funding for CARICOM. I learned something. 50% of CARICOM funding comes from external sources, meaning outside of the region. Think of what that means for political economy perspectives. Then they argue that there's the absence of key stakeholders, civil society and private sector, also well known, point well taken. Key recommendations. Well, if the problem is responsibility and accountability being separated, we need to merge the two together. They argue for a CARICOM Auditor General, several oversight committees, rationalization of CARICOM organs. Who can argue these things? These things are like roti and curry, right? There's no argument against these proposals. For funding, well, they want to play with some of the formulas. They do not zoom in on one, but they want to consider other things like per capita income and economic growth rate rather than debt-adjusted GDP, and several ideas on sanctionings or late payments, etc. As it relates to civil society and private sector, they recommend a host of things. For example, we should all recognize CARICOM Day, or we should have unrestricted free movement of labor. The 5-year timeline. And this is what I call the ultimatum. First, I think it's unrealistic because you have to really consider and think about what is required to have a fully functional CSME, all right? Now, I think with global disintegration, I think with domestic backlashes for migration flows, I think what's happening in the Eurozone, if you're going to make a case for strong integration to CSME, we need some tentative data, some evidence. Who's going to benefit and how much? No such estimates have been produced in the Golden Report, and I think this is unfortunate to say the least. I'm going to move on. Could we have a switch? I think this is not working, definitely not working. I'm sorry, the previous slide? Yeah. Now, why am I emphasizing predictions or estimates? It's important. Politics, it's about distributive issues. Politics is about who gets what and how much, or who got more. So obviously, if you want political buy-in at the level of member states, I think you can make a strong case if you're going to say Trinidad is going to get X, Belize is going to get Y, Jamaica is going to get X. These are tentative estimates, of course, but this is how you will build consensus. So I'm emphasizing that we should have tentative estimates of what the distributional outcomes would be of a fully functional CSME. And they dropped the ball on that. Now, I have a question mark with Demas, because Demas famously said that the complaints from the Eastern Caribbean was out of order. He thought that the issue was not about convergence, or we shouldn't be worried about polarization. It's whether you're able to grow faster within the CSME as compared to as outside the CSME. Obviously, I take a different view from Demas because, as I said, polarization or distributive outcomes matter for politics and whether people choose to stay in within a particular union or not. This is certainly the issue in the Eurozone. Yeah? So, in the absence of these tentative estimates, and we have a mandate, 5 years, so we're asking our partners to take a major leap of faith, I'd say. Next slide, please. Then they have this other recommendation. We should remove this category of more developed and less developed countries. Now, Article 1 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas talked about disadvantaged countries as being less developed countries. Then Article 4 defines what they mean by less developed countries, and they're listed there. So these two articles are very specific, very concrete. Now, there is an Article 158 that talks about protection for disadvantaged sectors, regions, and countries. Now, the Golden Report says because of Article 158, we don't need Article 1 or Article 4. So if you were to remove Article 1 or 4 and rely on Article 158, it means disadvantaged countries, meaning the Eastern Caribbean, are not predefined. Automatically, they will lose their special and differential treatment. And I can cite a host of studies that emphasize that their relative success is because of special and differential treatment. Then we need a healthy dose of history here. The reason we have MDC and LDC is because of an old insecurity in the Eastern Caribbean. They've always been concerned about the absence of their production or industrial capabilities. There was this famous Montserrat paper at one of these meetings, a surprise paper that said, look, we need distributed transfers. We're not gaining, we're not benefiting, we need production, we need firms being located. So they emphasized that we're going to have, this was the purpose of the Caribbean Development Bank, was supposed to fund the Eastern Caribbean. And then they had this cute invention of more developed, less developed distinction. My point is this. This is important for social cohesion purposes, for political purposes, for symbolism purposes. So I take a different view from the Golden Report as it relates to removing this category. Next slide, please. Sorry, the previous one. So in this paper, I try to distill, none of this, the next slide, sorry. Yeah. What has been written before me, some before I was born, about what other scholars think are the real reasons we have this so-called implementation deficit. And my choice of so-called is deliberate. Now, Gervin, no, the previous one, sorry. Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is working now. Yeah. So the first one I thought was obvious, but clearly it was not, because it was absent in the Golden Report, is differences in production structure. What do I mean by this? Very recently, Barry Jagdeo, former president of Guyana, threatened to withhold his signature from the EPA, and he called for a goods-only agreement. The problem with that, the services-based Caribbean economies obviously will find disagreement with that. Now, Patsy Lewis and seminal work, I think, tried to emphasize that the reason that they had a breakdown in talks on political union is precisely because of these differences in economic structures within the OECS, meaning goods-based economies, service-based economies could not agree on the need or necessity for political union because they have different benefits or costs from policy harmonization. So I make the case that dissimilar economic structures, one reason why we can't find consensus on key issues as it relates to policy harmonization. This was not mentioned in the Golden Report. It was all about bureaucratic inertia. The problem is CARICOM Secretariat. The next one, which certainly is more relevant as it relates to Europe, the United States, and the rest of the world, is differences in inequality within countries, in one hand, and differences in inequality between countries. Very quickly. If citizens in a given country are being pushed to the lower ends of the income distribution, they're going to express this frustration. History tells us, and present-day reality tells us, that this frustration is expressed through xenophobia. This is the politics now of migration issues. So one reason, perhaps, why free movement is not as free might be because the Bajans, and we'll see data in a few, have been losing income share, and they have to express this anger somewhere. Trump, of course, is taking advantage of this anger. The other thing is, if countries in a community have different welfare systems, this is going to be attractive for certain kind of skilled labor or certain kinds of citizens. And if migrant flows are excessive, it potentially can undermine the efficiency or the sustainability of these welfare programs. And this too can put the brakes on the so-called free movement. The only point I want to emphasize here was summed up by David Hines in 2006, that internal integration might serve as a recipe for regional integration. In other words, could we be sincere about regional integration and have political, socioeconomic disintegration within our countries? I hardly have to convince you, or that is the case within our countries in the region. I'm sorry, it's gone again. The next slide. Two other reasons that can potentially explain the so-called implementation deficit is the one by Gervin, and this is a pragmatic one, that we're just preoccupied with what we consider as more important stuff, that is signing other comprehensive free trade agreements. These things are time-bound with money being tied to it, so CARICOM and the CSME takes a back seat, and these are urgent matters that need to be addressed. These are not my ideas. Bernal, we know him very well in leading the EPA, and Gervin. Then there's a domestic mandate. So we need political consensus within a country. We need a political opposition to help us implement the CSME, yet they're not at the table. I mean, David Hines once said that the CSME is the noose on which the political opposition hangs the incumbent political party. None of this were captured in the Golden Report. The problem is with CARICOM Secretariat. And I emphasize that much of what is said in the Golden Report was said before, more comprehensively, in the Time for Action report in the 90s. Second slide, sorry, the next slide. Then I try to outline perhaps what we can learn, if anything at all, from the European Union, given that the genesis of Caribbean integration as it relates to CARIFTA certainly was inspired by the European movement or process. So we have what is called a typical political trilemma. You can only choose two of those three options. National sovereignty, democratic politics is the status quo. It's the emphasis of nation state, there's no community. So I will not discuss that. Now, presently the European Union is choosing monetary union and national sovereignty. So you have an executive federalism, and this is the ambition of CARICOM. Yeah? This is the ambition of the CSME. We've tried a federation. We agreed, apparently, that we don't need political unity. We need this type of organization, nation states within a monetary union of sorts. Now, we have, I think, firsthand experience, so we're witnessing what this would look like. Now, what we observe in the European case is you have a technocratic dictatorship that is undermining welfare programs, minimum wages, and making decisions only in the interest of what I would call the Eurozone core, Germany in this case. For example, and very concretely, inflation rates diverged in the Eurozone countries, but the inflation targeting policy at the level of the European Central Bank always and only considered the inflation rate in Germany, not the rest of the Eurozone countries. I emphasize again, this is the ambition of, this is what a fully functional CSM would be. The other option for the progressives on the far left, they would argue we need more Europe or we need Caribbean Federation, and this is the choice of democratic politics and monetary union. On the other hand, social solidarity in this sense only means this, a fiscal union with redistributive transfers like takes place in the United States. Now, what can we learn from this setup in the Eurozone case? That if we were to have a fully functional CSME, the forces of divergence will emerge and it will lead to threats of disintegration unless we deal with the issue of political decisions, meaning social solidarity, political transfers, fiscal union. Next slide, please. Now, Economists will tell you we need financial integration. This is the literature in Europe. This is certain literature here in the Caribbean. Why? Because we can have a convergence of interest rates to the lowest bound in the region. This is good for business, right? Better risk sharing if we were to integrate financially, more efficient allocation of capital, and of course this will boost growth and lead to economic convergence. And this is the rationale for integration. This is the narrative. The outcomes in the Eurozone case tells us the following. Capital was misallocated to non-tradables and low technology goods and services in the poor parts of the Eurozone, meaning the periphery, I mean pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece in particular. It actually led to a deindustrialization, I emphasize, deindustrialization in the Eurozone periphery. We'll see some data in a minute. It encouraged a housing bubble in the Eurozone periphery. In the end, financial integration divided Europe. Next slide, please. Before I comment on this, now, the point of the previous slide was not to argue against financial integration or against the importance of finance. That's not the point. Our type of country certainly need finance. We need development finance rather than finance integration per se. Yeah, there's a significant difference there. All right, so what we're looking at, I hope you can see this. What we're looking at here is the value-added share for manufacturing relative to Germany. So everything you see is compared to Germany. The only point I want to emphasize is this. For high and medium technology, value-added manufacturing as compared to Germany, what we're observing from 1999 to 2007, please take note of the dates, this is what deindustrialization looks like. Why? Because financial integration led to capital inflows in the Eurozone periphery that went into housing construction or consumption of other goods and services, and reallocate the capital from industry. Industry is still important. Ask the Germans. Of course, the periphery gained in the lowest technology dimension. This will lead to polarization in growth and income. Next slide, please. Dominic Hartman and his co-authors constructed what they call a product Gini index. And the point of this is simple. Some commodities are consistent with certain kind of inequality outcomes. So it's better for distributional purposes to produce certain goods and services other than others. Yeah? And they're able to show, I hope you can see this, for example, high inequality goods would be like cocoa beans, flour, animal hair. Machinery, high technology commodities are consistent with low inequality outcomes. Why am I showing you this? I mentioned earlier that the countries in the region are divided, goods versus services, manufacturing versus commodities. It means distributional outcomes in these countries will differ, and this will lead to all kinds of polarization and migrant flows that can exacerbate political compromises. Next slide. This is the best data we have in the region. We're looking at here on the far right are income shares from top 10% to the bottom as of 2013. The far right shows the richest 10% in Guyana appropriate 41% of household income in 2013. Think about what that means for a second. This data comes from household surveys. This is available online. You can download and reproduce these results. I'm not going to discuss the left part. So when I emphasize in 2013, this is what inequality looks like. And by the way, these are household surveys. It means there's massive underreporting. So it's probably worse than this. Next slide. I apologize for how this looks, but that's the graph. What we're looking at here is the top 10%, the richest 10% in CARICOM countries for which I have data. Now, so there is a dashed horizontal line that divides the region into two parts. I'm calling high inequality countries, low inequality countries. For example, the high inequality countries would be Belize, Suriname, Jamaica, Guyana. The low inequality countries here would be the Bahamas, Trinidad, and Barbados. By the way, that line I'm moving up, that's inequality in Barbados since 1970. So the top 10% in Barbados have increasing their income share since 1970 for decades. Immediately what popped in my mind when I saw this data was this perhaps can explain the tensions between Barbadians and perhaps Guyanese or other migrants, maybe, I don't know. One could perhaps make a similar story with Jamaica and Trinidad here. Next slide, please. The story is the same. If you disaggregate the top 10% into the richest 1%, the richest 5%, the same countries, the same division holds. Why am I showing you this? Because this is what explains the so-called implementation deficit. These are factors we need to consider. It's more than just saying we need to integrate because in an aggregate it makes sense. In real politics, at the nation-state level, we need to deal with these issues. All right, next slide. That's the end. So, in summary form, the Golden Report failed on its own terms. It did not present a serious analysis of how CARICOM affects Jamaica. It has not analyzed the so-called implementation deficit. Everything for them, as I emphasized, is about bureaucratic inertia. None of the things I showed for the past 5 to 10 minutes found mention in the report. Notwithstanding this major underachievement, we have the Jamaican ultimatum of 5 years to have a fully functional CSMA. How will it work? We don't know. We should just go about integrating. Now, I want to emphasize I'm for integration. I hope I have not given you the impression that I oppose integration. I'm just calling for less European integration in the Caribbean and a bit more Caribbean integration. Now, it's a fair question to ask me, what does that mean? It's a fair question. And I hope to spend the rest of my life answering that question. But I will say this, that the purpose for European integration in the beginning was to expand trade for German exports. Let's be very clear about this. It was to increase trade for Germany and had a political motive. They needed to contain the Soviet Union. We do not have that clear hegemon here. We do not have Germany's industrial capabilities here. The basis of integration needs to be other reasons. We have nothing to trade each other. We knew this 30 years ago. So I admit to you, I don't have a clear-cut answer. Clive Thomas perhaps might say production integration. I'm willing to entertain that idea, but we still have to go back to the question of distribution. How are we going to share the fruits of the proceeds? This requires some level of political consensus. And that's the last point I have here, that history and recent evidence shows that if integration projects are going to sustain themselves over time, you need redistributive mechanisms or social solidarity mechanisms because there will be winners and losers. And politics is about taking advantage of the divisions between winners and losers. This requires some level of political unity. Does it require federation? Maybe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin, for your presentation. The next item on the agenda is by Carlos Elias, Adjunct Professor of Economics, Radford University in the United States. And his presentation is Findings of the Forum on the Future of the Caribbean. Carlos?
Well, good morning. As you heard, my name is Carlos Elias, but I was born in South America, so I say Elias. I wear many different hats. I teach economics. I prefer to teach monetary and banking classes. I like econometrics and I like microeconomics. And facing the last 20 years of my professional life, I decided to turn one of my hobbies, I ride motorcycles, into a business. So I bought a motorcycle business. I have all these hats on top of me, and I'm an international consultant. I work for the IDB, the World Bank. I do international consulting, so as you can see, I have many, many interests. Just in case you're wondering, my last name is Elias, but I'm not related to the wealthy families in the region. I'm poor. I work for a living. I really want to thank the organizers, the Institute of International Relations. I want to thank Sarah Wilkes Reiser for logistical help, and of course, Professor Dukaran. Now, my thanks to Professor Dukaran go beyond the invitation to talk to you. Thanks to him, the last 4 years have been intellectually rewarding, as you will know, as I will explain in this conversation with you. Where's my thingy? Here it is. I'm not used to talk without moving, so we'll see how it goes. I drive my students crazy because I like to move a lot. So what I'm going to tell you is what I think, or what I was asked to do was to talk about the forum and the results. I will take advantage of this meeting to share with you some ideas that I have on convergence that were inspired by Professor Dukaran out of many conversations and many joint intellectual debates. And I think there is something about convergence that merits sharing, especially in a small meeting such as this one, where many people can talk and tell us what you think. So the forum. The forum was held in Porto, Spain, 2015. By all measures, it was a tremendous success. 400 people attended or more. All the names that you can think of were there in terms of institutions. I won't name them all, but if it's a Caribbean with relevance institution, someone represented them, governments, prime ministers. Numbers or names that you will recognize include Beckles, Watson, Dukaran, politicians, Gonsalves, and many, 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 many others. Some relevant names these days. Amina Mohammed was there. Now she's, as you know, the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. At the time she was not. And many others. Do you mind clicking on the, I want you, this is very short, 2-3 minutes, and then I'll continue talking.
The University of the West Indies and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Trinidad and Tobago, in conjunction with the United Nations system in Trinidad and Tobago and a wide range of international development partners, will host a new forum on the future of the Caribbean. The Forum on the Future of the Caribbean brings together political leaders, academia, private sector leaders, youth, civil society, and policymakers to engage in a vigorous debate and discussion and encourage disruptive thinking, search for bold action, and identify practical outcomes. Our key themes will be capturing the ambitions for the region, embracing Caribbean convergence, shaping a new global compact through diplomacy, tackling poverty and inequality, and advocating innovative financing solutions.
The world is undergoing major new realignments in power and in the paradigms of development. And the Caribbean must find itself in a position to adjust to that.
To come together and really forge new ideas and new partnerships and new thinking for the Caribbean in the interests of sustainable development.
We are hoping that some of the thorny issues, the thorny practical issues of poverty, income inequality, sustainable development, will see there will be a discussion that will lead to a breakthrough in all of this.
Disruptive in the sense that we sort of get rid of old paradigms and introduce new paradigms, new ways of thinking about development.
What we need are some new voices and some progressive thinking on issues which can be disruptive, like sexual and reproductive rights.
The Caribbean region has been facing numerous economic, social, and environmental.
Okay, so enough of that. Bring me back to, I think I can bring myself back to where it was. So they did something that was, that sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't, but when you invite people to be disruptive, it's a risk. Out of this forum, we wrote this book, and in this book, one of the main pillars of writing this book, Priya, is right here, Priya Mohan. In this book, we tried to summarize what happened during the forum. Now, Professor Sankat at the time, he told us on his opening remarks, he said what most of you probably, and most of us, all of us have said or thought at some point in our lives, including our previous presenter, Colin here, right? The what if. So the what if, right? What if we do things differently? And he said things such as, what if we remove every barrier to trade? What if we ensure free movement of people? Things that are so dear, so close to us. What if Trinidad and Tobago utilizes its geographic location, become a transshipment hub? He even suggested a bridge to Venezuela. What if regional U.W.I becomes pan-Caribbean, right? Beyond the English-speaking Caribbean. What if we fund higher education? What if we fund it for real, right? So that we can do research and learn from it. What if? The point that he was making is, I want you to tell me what you want us to do. And what came out of this what if conversation was, I'm pointing the wrong one, was this. What came out of this conversation of the what if was the following. People stood up and told us one thing. They said, please, or pretty please, they said, stop talking and start doing. That's what they said. We are not interested in more words, we want action. And the action that I was referring to was very, very specific. In the book, we put down all the suggestions that were made during the forum, but 4 stood up as very interesting, very concrete. It was not about theory, it was not about thinking, it was not about, what ifs, it was let's do something. And they said, let's do sea and air transport. They said, look, my mother is from Guadeloupe, my father is from St. Vincent, and I live in Trinidad. How come it's easier for me to fly to New York than to go visit my family in the region? Why is it more expensive to do that? Could you please do something about sea and air transport in the region? They also said energy. When you look at energy and energy networks in the region, you see many, many differences. Some countries, such as Guyana, suffer from lack of energy. Energy is extremely expensive, as you probably know. Some others do not, such as Trinidad here. Why can't we find a way of reallocating resources in such a way that all of us have access to what we need in terms of energy? And I'm not just talking, of course, about industry. I'm talking also about households, government, etc. Third, finance, same idea. They said, look, you look at financial sectors in the region that have excess resources, and you look at financial sectors in the region that do not have enough. And when you're an entrepreneur and you need financing, and you go to Suriname to request a loan, you get an interest rate in real terms that is much higher than the one you would get in some of the other economies. So this reallocation of resources makes sense. Why can't you do something about it? That's in your power. They told us. Finally, they said, food security. At some time in the year in Barbados, it's almost a luxury item to find onions and garlic. Whereas you walk into Georgetown and you can buy anything you want at a price that is really low. So why can't you help us fix this? So that's what they told us. They said, look, stop talking, start doing. But they said something else, and this was said not explicitly but implicitly. And the rest of my conversation with you has to do with this notion of convergence. The unintended, I call it, outcome of this forum was there is something about convergence that is special, the concept. There is something about convergence that merits thinking more carefully. And I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes, about 5 or 8 more, sharing with you my views on convergence. The disclaimer is that this is work in progress. This is almost a brainstorming opportunity for me to people like you sitting around the tables to tell me if it makes sense and how much it makes sense. So I was preparing to this conversation, and in preparing, I was looking at I was reading or rereading or relearning from Sir Alister McIntyre. That's the man that brought us here today. And of course, being such a giant of a Caribbean man, his writings say it all. And I was reading, and I was, relearning and trying to understand how he thought about integration, what it meant to him. And then I came across this paper. This paper was wrote in 1989, and the title is The Right to Choose: Some Lessons of Independence in the Field of External Economic Relationships, published in the Caribbean Quarterly. In this paper, McIntyre is sharing with us his experiences about integration. And he's talking in general about integration. And he's talking about the cost and the benefits. This is 1989, something that Colin was mentioning perhaps before. And then as I'm reading, I get to this last sentence, and I almost fell off my chair when I was reading this, because in my head I was thinking about convergence and how to put together the ideas that I have and try to weave in the thinking of McIntyre. So in his last sentence, he says the following. After talking about integration and the questions that we have to say, he says, there are limits to sovereignty for all, large and small, developed and developing. And the reason why I almost have a minor heart attack when I was reading this is the following. Because I was thinking about convergence and what it means. So this idea of convergence started when knowing the Caribbean so well, or knowing South American so well, Caribbean people, South American people, Latin people, they have a feeling of togetherness, right? My mom is from here, my dad is from there, and I live somewhere else, and yet we feel Caribbean, right? When we play cricket, we have one team. When we go to Olympics, we wish we had one team, then we would win all the track and field gold medals in the Olympic Games. So this idea of convergence started like that. And it's a concept of, okay, what does it really mean? Now, the approach that I took is positive, right? This is not a normative approach. This is not, I want things to be this way. I was trying to understand, you see, in economics and social science in general, we watch processes in motion, and we try to make sense of them. And I sense that, that such as, some other processes, including integration, including economic integration, what we're witnessing is a convergence process. It's like the tide, it's like a wave. It cannot be stopped. It's not a choice. It happens. And it has many different types of way of looking at it. And then I started thinking, okay, so how do we look at these different types? Let me get out of here. How do we look at all these different types of convergence? And one way was what Dukaran did 4 years ago in one of his books as well. He said, look, if convergence is good, and this concept that we're trying to understand that is much more than economics, Jessica Byron mentioned Girvan before, and others, that convergence is culture, is social, it's more than just economics, it's complex. It's a dynamic process. So if this process is happening, and we perceive that it would have positive outcomes, there are ways that we can think about making it happen faster. Duker proposed, well, why don't we start thinking about 4 areas of intervention that, as I said, if convergence is what we think it is you can't stop it. You can delay it or you can accelerate it, but right? This is life. So he said, let's look at finance, let's look at clustering, thinking about production, let's look at infrastructure, and let's look at more generally production. So if we do that, I think we miss what all the other aspects of what is not. What I was trying to do is really to understand, so, okay, let's figure out what convergence is. And in thinking that way, I say, okay, what is not, right? Those of you that are economists have been taught in school that Robert Solow, which earned a Nobel Prize in economics, because he tried to understand how production happens, how growth happens, right? This is a fascination for us economists. Robert Lucas said, once you start thinking about growth, it's really hard to think about anything else. And look, Solow, what he taught us is there are these factors of production that come into place, there's innovation, and depending where you are on the growth process, because of diminishing returns, we keep growing, but we grow slower. So China should grow faster than the US. Yeah. And then the convergence from an economic perspective is really an income convergence, in which when you look at countries, what you see is that the gaps narrow, right? That the gaps narrow over time. That is not the convergence we're talking about, although there is a little bit of that in it. What else is it? What else is not? It's not pure integration. You see, pure integration is a supply side of the equation, right? We want to integrate. We want CARICOM. We want the ACS. The integration process that is determined by convergence happens through production networks, logistics, financial networks, social, cultural networks, and more. It's not pure regional integration either. It's not, because you see this togetherness I was referring to when I was thinking about how Caribbean people feel. I mean, that's part of it. It has to do with social media, but it's not only social media. It has to do with culture, but it's not only culture. So what is it? What is it? So what is convergence? I was thinking, so I made a real effort to try to write it down, perhaps not too successfully, but I said it's a framework for understanding a complex process in motion of transactions within networks that do not recognize borders or barriers. And the last part is the key part, and that's why I almost fell off the chair when I read McIntyre writing in 1889 that these trade-offs have to recognize the limits of sovereignty, right? He said that. He could sense, I think his intuition was telling him, perhaps in a different context, what we're trying to understand today. So these networks, these complex networks that have different aspects, of which economics and finance, which are the ones I understand better, are only a part of it, and perhaps not the most important part. And they're based on transactions, and it's dynamic, and it changes all the time, and it's organic, it's endogenous. So we're witnessing, we don't make it happen, it's happening. So it has to do with business, with finance, with trade, with culture. It accommodates a whole bunch of things, heterogeneity and homogeneity, that is the conversations of income inequality. It accommodates and explains all of those within a country, between countries, within people. I mean, I come to realize that, for example, a professional, a young professional in Puerto Spain probably has a similar lifestyle as a young professional in Manhattan. There's more differences between a young professional working in Manhattan and a rural person working in Virginia. There are more differences than that than someone, I mean, we all have phones, we all have access to health and education. There's something about this concept of convergence that's quite interesting. And then I use this, it's not the first time that I do this, but the idea is the following. This is a thought experiment, right? This is our beautiful Caribbean Sea, the one that you see, that you know so well, right? This is where we are. Now, and this is just one type of space, the geographical space. Somebody was referring about different spaces. The geographical space is one aspect, but only one of many. When you close your eyes and you think about the Caribbean from networks, from the perspective of, say, financial networks, say, cultural networks, say, logistics. When you look at the Caribbean with those eyes, this geographical space changes shape. And hence, the title of this book, when Professor Dukaran came with this name, right, Shifting the Frontiers, it opened up my eyes about this idea of convergence and how to think about it. Because shifting the frontiers in this thought experiment means that when you look at it from the network perspective, it looks very different. You know, these land masses that are separated by an ocean become close, and they grow as based on what you look. If we look at culture, we see one great landmass, right? The English-speaking Caribbean. Perhaps we see a second one, the Spanish-speaking, and there are interconnections of them, but perhaps they're separate, but perhaps they're getting closer because as time goes by. You see how it's happening? The thought experiment works because the concept is informative. Okay. To finalize this conversation, and there is something I want to do here, if I can. There's something I need to do first, because when I'm thinking about convergence, I'm thinking of a new development paradigm. And to do that, I really need to explain what I mean by a paradigm, right? We use words many times in loose ways, but paradigm, according to Merriam-Webster, is a philosophical and theoretical framework or a scientific school or discipline within which theories, laws, and generalizations and the experiments performed in support of them are formulated. Let me repeat. A paradigm is a philosophical and theoretical framework or a scientific school of thought or discipline within which theories, laws, and generalizations and the experiments performed in support of them are formulated. I think this idea of convergence has a little bit of that, or has tremendous promise for that. If convergence is a paradigm, then what stands out to me, right? The first thing that stands out to me is that the primary unit of analysis is not the country anymore. We don't need to, I mean, we've been shackled by this idea perhaps I am, and all the economists such as me are. Our unit of analysis is the country. I mean, when we ask our statistical offices, we're thinking about countries and regions, we think countries and municipalities. That unit of analysis in the context of a new paradigm in which convergence plays a central role is not as important. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying it's not the primary unit of analysis. It's something else. What else? Well, if the primary unit of analysis is not important, the role of government is not as important either. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I'm saying the role of government is not as important as we think it is. Third, the role of diplomacy has to be completely modernized. We have to think about diplomacy in a completely different way if convergence turns out to be what I hope or I think it is. Size matters, yes. Okay. Size matters. The role of the private sector grows exponentially, but not of multinationals. Because if convergence is networks of transactions and their complexity and their dynamism that goes beyond not just economic transactions such as buying and selling goods and services, but it includes social and culture and more, then the role of the private sector is highlighted, but it's endogenous, it's organic. Okay, and let me finish this conversation. I think I took enough of your time, but at least I have been dissatisfied with our previous paradigms. I think the last time we have a serious discussion about paradigms was in the late 70s. Well, the 60s, 70s, and 80s were rich in these conversations, right? The 90s sort of ended that period, and I think since then we have not have, yes, we have papers and we have books, but we really need to put together a framework, and this framework around this issue of convergence may be the one that we need. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Ladies and gentlemen, I received a note here telling me that there should be a break at 10:30 that is not on the program, but having not been programmed before, what I would suggest that you do that if you want any refreshment or whatever, you can go and have it and bring it back to your table, and so that we can continue with the momentum that we have. Because the next presenter, as I indicated to you, there's a switch between 4 and 5, so that 5 is now 4 and 4 is now 5. So Jennifer Sobotka, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Radford University, USA, is going to make a presentation now on Brazilian integration. Is the convergence process taking root? Jennifer?
Morning. This is my first time in Trinidad, and thank you everyone for welcoming me to this beautiful country, in particular to U.W.I and the organizing committee, to Professor Dukerin. It's been a wonderful experience so far, so again, thank you. As you may notice, I am a professor, and there are a couple of things that professors really enjoy doing. One of them is talking. So I have to confess that the last time that I was in the Caribbean giving a presentation, I was actually co-presenting with Dr. Elias, and the unfortunate moderator of that event spent the last 10 minutes of my presentation going 10, 9, 8, as I slowly counted down not only my time, but my co-presenter's time. So, I've been granted my own slot. I will try to keep within the limits of that, if at all possible. Okay, the other thing that professors really enjoy doing is giving tests. So let's see how we're going to start out with, let's think of it as a pop quiz, right? So you haven't had a chance to study for this one yet. And I am, there we go. All right, so we're going to start with something called the Ignorance Survey. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this. This is based on surveys that were conducted under the guidance of Dr. Hans Rosling, who passed away about 3 years ago. And Dr. Rosling was conducting this survey in the hopes of not testing for ignorance, but in fact teaching people more about the world around us, based on the idea that the only way to move forward is to understand where we are right now. Okay, so here we go. Let's see how we all do on this. Let's hope that as experienced, seasoned development specialists, we do better than, say, the first-year principles of economics students that I usually use this with. Okay. So in the last 20 years, the proportion of people in the world who are living in extreme poverty has doubled, remained more or less the same, or been cut in half. All right, so we'll do it informally. How many people think that the share of people living in extreme poverty in the past 20 years has almost doubled? Show of hands, please. Okay, it's remained about the same. Show of hands. Or it has been cut in half. All right, well, we're already doing better than my students. Congratulations. Yes, in fact, that has been dropped in half. And by the way, this survey has been conducted in a variety of countries. The results they're accurate as of 2017. Okay. All right, next question. What's the life expectancy of the world population? So do we think it's 50 years, 60, or 70? And 70. So we're doing okay here, right? So let's look again at another area within the health field, okay? What percentage of the world's children, 1-year-olds, have been vaccinated? 80, 50, or 20%? And again, this was an area of particular interest for Dr. Rosling, as he was, in fact, a medical doctor. So 80% of the world's children have been vaccinated. Yes? Well, 50%. Or 20%. All right, we could use a little bit of work on that, but then most of us aren't medical professionals, so that's okay. Let's look at a different area, literacy. How many adults, or what percentage of adults in the world today are literate? And again, 80, 60, or 40 are our choices. 80%? Okay, 60%. Or 40%? Panel is not participating, they're afraid. Okay. No, 80%, and I turned it off because I'm very good at this. All right, sorry. 80% of the world's adults are in fact literate. And by the way, all of these are vast improvements over where the world was even just 20 years ago. Okay. Sorry? So another area in education, but now focusing on gender. By the time a man reaches the age of 30, on average in the world, he's spent 10 years in school. Now, clearly, we have all surpassed that. But again, thinking worldwide averages, men, age of 30, have spent 10 years in school. What about women? By the time a woman has reached the age of 30, how many years has she spent in school compared to a man? 9 or 3? I think it's 9. 6 or 3? Again, this is worldwide, right? Not in the Caribbean. 9. Okay? So women worldwide have almost the same educational attainment as men. All right. And lastly, and this is a little delicate given the recent events in the Bahamas, and my condolences to anyone who has directly or indirectly experienced that, let's think about natural disasters and the effects of those. So this is not a percentage question, this is in raw numbers. Right? What has happened over the past 100 years in terms of deaths due to natural disaster? Has that number doubled, remained the same, or decreased to less than half? And again, actual deaths, not percentages or anything like that. So, doubled, remained about the same, reduced by half. Well, despite population growth, and certainly most of us are not going to argue that there are fewer natural disasters now than there were 100 years ago, in fact, the number of people who die due to those disasters has been cut in half. Well, first of all, my congratulations. We've certainly done better than my first-year students who tend to get about a 30% on this. I'd say we passed, so that's good. What else have we learned? Well, the world has improved, and in many cases, the world is probably in a better place than we think that it is. My question is, how can we continue this trend? What do we need to understand in order to make sure that the world is going to continue on this upward trajectory that has taken so far. And what I've decided to do here is to look towards Brazil as an example. So this may appear to be a somewhat unusual choice. After all, we're in the Caribbean at the moment. We're not in South America. And yet we're looking south to this enormous country that dominates the continent for the most part, to give us some guidance looking forward. Well, I'm going to try and convince you that Brazil is an example, not just in terms of how the world has moved over the past 100+ years, how it can move forward, but can in fact be a guide for convergence. And let's start by looking at Brazil's history in areas that were particularly interesting to, in this case, to Dr. Rosling, which would be wealth and health. Okay, so if you would please, this is a chart developed by Dr. Rosling that shows us Brazil's movement over the past 200 years. Brazil is one of those countries that has always been on the brink of and never quite achieved what we think. So what we're looking at here is Brazil's progression, yep, go ahead, thank you, along the income axis and the life expectancy axis starting in about 1800. You can see there's very little movement here. There's fluctuations in Brazil's progress for the first 100 years or so. And then, in fact, it isn't until after World War II that we see this really impressive increase in income and in health as well. As we get to some of the financial crises, there's a little bit of wobbling back and forth. That's the inability of Brazil to take that final step that everyone keeps looking for. But clearly there has been not just an increase, but a type of convergence along with other countries that Brazil was able to accomplish. Okay, thank you. All right, so in what ways has Brazil been able to achieve this convergence? Right. In addition to income and health, there's also something that I assume most people are familiar with called the Human Development Index. And what we can see with that is that in the past, say, according to this 20 years, but I'll just update it briefly, there has been improvement in Brazil, significant improvement, in fact, in the Human Development Index, which includes not just its income, education, and health factors combined. In 1991, Brazil, almost the entire country was what was considered a low or less human development. And it moved eventually to a point where in 2010, most of the country was in the medium, some was in the high range, although there were still pockets of low. Clearly this is progress. In fact, the most recent number for Brazil as a whole would indicate that it has reached into the high, the average is in the high, 0.76, excuse me, which would take it consistently into the high range, that light green. And likely there are pockets of the very high, although we don't have the municipal data on that, so I cannot guarantee it. But what we see here is clear improvement in all areas of the country, not perfectly consistent across the country as a whole, but nonetheless looking upwards. Similarly, if we look at income inequality over time, what we have is, and I'm going to consider this point an outlier, honestly, but there's a consistent decrease in the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality since about 1985. So we started 1980, and from 1985 on, there has been a decrease. And if we look beyond that at individual state performance, then what this diagonal line indicates is an equal, basically an equal share over time. So that the states below the line are those that are doing less well, or were doing less well in 2007 relative to the other states than they were in 1980. In other words, opposed to, say, São Paulo, Rio Grande do Sul, Rio, Pará, Amazonas. So the poorer states have done better. Now, there's an exception. The federal district it's one city that was created in the 60s, so that growth rate is perhaps not relevant. And unfortunately, Pará and Amazonas are two of the poorer states, and yet they did not grow as quickly. I'm going to hypothesize that that has to do with technology, another subject that we're going to talk about briefly. As transport has improved, there are much more efficient ways to move products than along the Amazon River. And so we see now that some of that commercial activity has died out in that area as people are able to either use e-commerce to move things around, or even things like airplanes have become much more affordable. Now, having been on a cargo ship that went from Belém in Pará to Manaus in Amazonas, I think it's probably okay that there's not as much travel like that. It's not very pleasant. So one more area, actually two more areas that we'll look at: labor force and education in terms of gender disparities. So the labor force participation rates in Brazil indicate that men are more active in the labor force, which is what one would expect in any country. But with increased years of education, women's participation rates approach those of men. Right? And this is particularly important because, in fact, what we see is that consistently, women actually have more education than men do in Brazil. On this graph, you'll see the darker lines represent females and the lighter lines males. That is, the white females are the dark orange and the white males are the yellow or light orange, and the non-white, it's black or auto is the way it's described. Females are blue, whereas the men are gray. And in almost without exception, women have higher educational attainment than men do. There's a slight difference here in the southeast where men are slightly above women. But consistently for the rest of it, women in fact have more education. Again, going back to the fact that as you have more education as a female, you are more likely to be active in the workforce. That's particularly important. Now, if we want to look at the racial aspects of this, there are also, and yes, there is an enormous gap that shows, or not enormous, there is a gap between white and non-white in these numbers, but what we can see is that over time, that is decreasing. So if we look at the white average years of schooling on top, and then the two non-white divisions below, that gap is narrowing. More important than that, however, is the fact that both of these are growing at truly impressive rates. So in the years between 1982 and 2007, what you can see is that whites increase their average years of schooling by about 50%. Non-whites double. So regardless of the gap between the two, there's a clear upward movement indicating that education attainment has increased, and that's something that I think we should all be very appreciative of. Okay, so everything's doing great. How'd this happen? That's the real question that I want to answer, because I want to make sure it continues happening. So traditional economic explanations for this would be things like, well, natural resources, right? Certain countries have particular wealth based on their natural resources. Or certain countries, and we've heard a lot about trade, right? Trade is a clear factor in growth. Or we can talk about different types of capital accumulation. I mentioned education. Well, human capital accumulation is one of the engines of growth that's frequently mentioned. But we can also talk about financial capital. Thomas Piketty famously focuses on that, on different types of growth based on capital accumulation as being a factor in inequality. And then a slightly more modern version of growth theory looks into institutions. And then most of us will agree that technology has at least some role in determining the path forward. But I want to look at something a little bit different here, and this is where the role of Brazil becomes important. Because if we think about these traditional explanations, then Brazil and the Caribbean perhaps do not have as much in common as I'm going to try to convince you that they do. The type of resources clearly are very different. The extent to which they are open trade, Brazil has gone through stages of open and not so open trade regimes, etc. So there are going to be a lot of differences here. But I think that the advancement in Brazil, and in fact throughout the world, is due to something else, something far more complex than any of these individual explanations. So now let's look at Brazil again, this enormous country, and think about how it compares to the Caribbean region. All right. I want to frame this discussion by starting talking about a book written by a man named Jared Diamond. I don't know the extent to which people are familiar with this, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Dr. Diamond, who wrote, he's written several books. Guns, Germs, and Steel was published in, I believe, 1997. It won a Pulitzer Prize. And what he looks at, for the most part, is how countries came to be arranged in the way that they were when Europe began to colonize the Americas and the rest of the world, but let's focus on the Americas. In other words, what was it that allowed Spain and England and Portugal and France to move towards the Americas rather than the native people in the Americas colonizing Europe? Right? And for the most part, Diamond's conclusion is that location was the factor. In other words, geography. Right? So now, Diamond was not an economist. He was not a sociologist. He's still alive. He's trained as a physiologist, an ethnobiologist, and eventually worked into a variety of fields related to that. But initially, his experience, he's a biologist. So let's look at this from Diamond's point of view. Okay. Clearly, Brazil and the Caribbean, they're both in the Americas. Diamond argues that the so-called north-south axis on which the Americas are oriented is a disadvantage, because that means that the continent encompasses several different climate ranges, making it particularly challenging for species of any type to move from one area to another. That plants, animals, people, to migrate from the northern tip to the southern tip of the continent is particularly challenging, as opposed to, say, Eurasia, where if you're moving east and west, you'll find similar climates that are hospitable to a variety of different species. Beyond that, there are going to be natural barriers. That is, even if you are talking about similar climates, the Americas have mountains, deserts, things that, again, are going to make it challenging for people, and therefore their ideas, to move across. Right? In the Caribbean, we can talk about, well, water. Right? It's not simple for seeds and animals and people to transport across fairly large distances of seas. Brazil, although one landmass, also has some of these natural barriers. The what's called Serra do Mar, the mountain range that's just off the coast. Although it's not as high as, say, the Andes, it does reach about 1,000 meters. It's fairly, it's an extreme increase. And then, of course, when you move from the coast inland, even if you were to get over those mountains, you immediately get deluged by these torrential downpours, and then you're in the jungle. Right? So this is not an easy trek to make, and in fact, quite recently there have been studies indicating that the interior of Brazil was underdeveloped for extended periods of time because of the difficulty in implementing any sort of infrastructure there. Right? So only recently has there been any attempt to develop that part, and in fact, the interior does lag behind in terms of income and generally in terms of economic development. So, what Diamond tells us is that at the time of European colonization, neither Brazil nor Trinidad had any significant civilization in place. That's not to say that there were not people here, of course, but rather that there were not people living in organized societies on the scale that we see or saw in Peru with the Incas, in Central America and Mexico with Aztecs and Mayan civilizations, or even there was a version of this in the middle of North America, the United States, the Missouri Valley civilization. Brazil did not have that, and Trinidad did not have that. So I'm going to argue that there is a way to look at Brazil's convergence history and apply it to the Caribbean. In fact, Diamond stops his analysis basically at this point, when the Europeans arrive. My favorite chapter is the Spaniards coming to Cajamarca in Peru, but there are other ones that are equally impressive if you want to look at the differences. If we want to look at more recent developments, then I would suggest that we look to Deirdre McCloskey's bourgeois trilogy as a roadmap to guide development. Now, Dr. McCloskey takes a very different view of development. Although she is a trained economist, in fact, her belief is that rhetoric has been the engine of growth since the Industrial Revolution, that it has proven to be a more dramatic factor than any other. And what she means by this, so for Diamond, geography drove innovation, and innovation drove growth. For McCloskey, innovative rhetoric that is changing the way that you think of and speak of, mostly people, is what can create growth, right? So for McCloskey, different languages, and by that not just specific differences as in English or Spanish or French, but different use of words and a different way of viewing cultures is what can prove particularly limiting in terms of growth. And specifically what she says is that people have to have both liberty and dignity in order to find a way forward. Right? So what does she mean by this? Liberty is the actual legal institution in place. That is, one has to be granted freedom under the legal system. But beyond that, there also has to be a recognition of the value of those people. So, for example, Brazil legally abolished slavery, right? Granting liberty to a group of people. But that's not the same thing as granting dignity to those people. And until Brazil is able to fully appreciate the contributions of that particular group of people, they are, in fact, pulling on the reins a little bit of development. And that's going to be true across the world, and McCloskey gives multiple examples. Okay. So one has to overcome these barriers in order to achieve your full potential for growth. And Brazil is a wonderful example of this in the following sense. Each region, and generally Brazil is divided into 5 regions, each region has different characteristics and certain jealousies or quinchas, different types of friction with other regions. So, for example, the south of Brazil, the far south, 5 minutes, thank you, sorry, here I go again. The far south tends to view the rest of the country as leeches, believing that they are providing the dominant growth. And there have been over time different sort of movements to secede from the country. In what is actually the economically dominant part of the country, Rio and Sao Paulo are constantly fighting with one another over who's the true engine of growth in the country. Brasilia views the rest of the country as ignorant and without any comprehension of how politics really works. That's where the seat of government is, of course. The Amazon feels completely ignored by the rest of the country, and the Northeast feels that they are generally being done wrong because of the way that they are treated, in part for cultural reasons. So how does Brazil get from all of these different separations into one big happy group of people, a little bit less happy since they lost to Peru in soccer the other day? Well, they have to unite the different cultures, and according to McCloskey's theory, bring everyone together, not necessarily as a single group of people, but in appreciation with respect for all of their differences. That's the alarm going off. So, what we see in Brazil is all sorts of different cultural aspects, right? There is the sort of standard Latin American culture, there is a larger African influence, an Amerindian group, as well as a small but significant purely German group. In order for these to be fully efficient, they need to all come together and create what we saw before, a large group. They do not have to be the same. McCloskey does not want everyone to be exactly the same, but simply to have, again, respect and provide dignity for all of the value that can come from different groups. So, finishing up. Coming full circle back to Dr. Rosling, right? In one of his videos, he says that we have become an entirely new converging world, and I see a clear trend into the future with trade, aid, green technology, and peace. Right? So, trade, by trade, I'm not talking about the specific economic view of trade. I want to expand that to include what Diamond talked about, what McCloskey talked about. So ideas, concepts, what really brings us together as people, for that to move across different cultures. And aid should not be simply aid from developed to developing countries, but aid within a country. Rosling talks only about green technology. I think that generally technology is an issue. What I was going to get to with this graph is that on occasion, technology and trade work against one another. So this is a graph of e-commerce in Brazil, and you'll see that there's this really impressive growth here. There was an attempt to impose certain taxes to redistribute the income that came from this from the wealthier states to the poorer states, resulting in a pretty dramatic drop-off of this type of trade that has been addressed, but sometimes technology can get ahead of us a little bit in terms of either the legislation or the regulations that involve it. And then finally, what we really need is not just peace between countries, but peace within. That is understanding, and I think these were points that were brought up by two of the previous speakers, by Professor Byron and aspiring Professor Constantine, that there's negotiating those differences is what's going to help us move forward. And you know, the internal versus regional integration is the first step. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your presentation. And we come to the final presentation on this panel, which will be by Professor of Practice, Professor Winston Dukaran from the Institute of International Relations, on the topic of regionalism in the Caribbean. Is economic convergence a new frontier? Winston?
First of all, let me thank Dr. Hamid Ghani for sparing the time and effort to be with us here this morning. He has invited many of us to many of his forums at the ISCR over the last year. And it is there I started my discussion on Arthur Lewis' theory of growth, which I spoke about yesterday. So I want to thank him for initiating that discussion as well. Today we have had a dimension of public policy that has been deeply troubling for us in the Caribbean, and indeed for the world at large. And what we heard from Jennifer, even within large countries like Brazil, and I suspect like China and India, there are processes of convergence in these large economic spaces. What we were working on in terms of trying to respond to the integration challenge that we face has been well articulated by Professor Byron in her synopsis of what has transpired in the world of literature in response to the policy requirements of the last many years. And of course, in the Caribbean region, there has been a lot of discussion which Colin brought to our attention here today on what really was the source of the paralysis, if you want to call it that, in the integration movement, as evidenced by so many various studies that have attempted to look at this. Today I just want to spend a few moments on two broad issues. One has to do with the notion of regionalism in a global context. There is a political and international relations dimension to the issue of globalism. There's no doubt that economic boundaries have lost their coercive power, and the market forces in an information world has made economic boundaries less of a coercive force. And to some extent, a lot of the issues that we are facing in integration movements throughout the world have been in response to the issue of sovereignty no longer having the capacity to enforce itself. With the advent of one information world, with the advent of technological changes, and with the advent of the change in balance of power. Because a large part of the integration process were hegemonic in the first place. In other words, they're derived from the hegemon and the various satellites, as they call it, developing in order to find an appropriate relationship with the hegemon, or hegemons as they defined it. That is now in a state of flux. So the international relations dimension have led many to begin to ask the question, what is the implication of that to the notion of regionalism? On that issue of regionalism, very interesting insight was given by the McKinsey Global Institute study on shifts in value change in the production function, of which you spoke about briefly yesterday. And what it said is that the globalization process, which many believe is in retreat, is not really in retreat. We are now at another chapter. And what is significant about that chapter is that regionalism would re-emerge as perhaps the compelling force, much more than globalism. This augurs very well for those of us who have been grappling with the issue of being lost in the globalized world, trying to have multi-tracks with every space to end up with no track at all. So if in fact regionalism has now become, or has got a new life, a new flashpoint in terms of the world economic order, then we must try to understand the dynamics of that regionalism. Another concept in international relations that has become very important in this context for regionalism, and I said earlier the world balance of power is in some kind of flux. We all know it, we all read it, we all feel it, we all sense it, and many leaders proclaim it. But for us in the world, that balance of power has now left a vacuum with the hegemonic decline that determined the world power structure. So some writers, particularly one person by the name of Amitav Acharya, who incidentally attended that conference that Carlos spoke about on the future of the Caribbean, then and subsequently, he made a distinction in his scholarship by talking about what he refers to as not the unipolar world anymore, not the multipolar world as many people were viewing it to become, but what he called a multiplex world. And I remember at the conference, he raised that concept in the context of the Caribbean finding a place, not in a multipolar world, which is what we thought we were moving into, but into a multiplex world. What did he mean by a multiplex world? Well, I wouldn't go into details of that, because that will require a paper of its own right. All I will make reference to is the implication of that multiplex world for small economies, which is what he spoke about. And I thought it is worthy of sharing this at this conference. He was talking about wiggle room. And in the conduct of international relations, how to find wiggle room for small states is really where we need to search in this multiplex world, which is not a world of many sources of power, but a world of a diffused set of forces, no longer determined only by political power, but determined by technology power, determined by market power, and determined, as Jennifer was mentioning in the case of Brazil, by civic power. And therefore, wiggle room for small states is where the search must go. And in the search for that wiggle room in the multiplex world will come the need in such a situation to find a space to increase that wiggle room. One way to increase that wiggle room in diplomatic terminology is to find more diplomatic space. And one way to do that is to have a wider diplomatic space within which you operate. In the old days, we called that a voice. And we said we must merge to have a voice. But now we are talking about having wiggle room on common interests. not having rigor room on geographical or historical or political aspirations. So a lot of the institutions of yesterday, like the non-aligned movements, etc., have lost their rationale. They continue to exist and used now, not for the original purposes for which they were intended, but as new platforms for the exercise of power relations, particularly by large countries. So wiggle room requires now a new kind of political regionalism. Notice I said it's not coming from the issue of economics as much as it's coming for the issue of finding some space. Interestingly, in that concept of finding more diplomatic space, and in that concept of looking at the conduct of international relations in today's world, we now come into this context of a new regionalism. The positive thing is that the forces of technology and the forces of the market and the forces of finance are converging towards a greater flow of appetite for regionalism. So I would expect in years to come, not too many years in the future, that there will be a resurgence of regionalism. And therefore we in the Caribbean must be prepared for the nature of that resurgence. If we try to fix the old order, which was structured in an old frame, it will not respond to the new order. And I think what we heard here from Colin about the attempt of the Bolden Commission to look at the integration limits and the results of it, and no wonder it has not got very far in terms of acceptance, is because it's trying to fix the old order and have defined the problem as an implementation problem. When the truth is, and although Colin didn't say this explicitly, it is an architecture problem. It's the architecture of the regional movement that needs to be addressed, not the implementation capacity. Because the implementation capacity cannot move because the architecture is not delivering the goods. What are the elements of that architecture that are not going to deliver the goods? So what are the goods? We know the goods, what they are, but what are the elements of it? So therefore, the new regionalism that might emerge, for the reasons I have outlined here and for other reasons, will require now to redesign the architecture of the regional effort. And it is in that context, I believe, we are beginning to search for new ways of trying to redesign that process. It didn't start with economics. It actually started with technology. I don't know enough about the field, but for what little I have read, technological convergence is taking place at a fantastic rate. And many technologies are now converging to create new production possibilities. every day you read on the newspaper or the journals, technology companies, particularly in the field of information, finding ways to get different products. So what is really driving this process is a technological convergence. Technological convergence in a broad sense. And therefore, however we define the architecture, must come to terms with the technological aspect. From a public policy perspective, technological process will require technological infrastructure to be able to exploit the advantage. And therefore, certain infrastructure, broadband, and all these kinds of things are very important in the Caribbean or any region to be able to access the benefits of the technological convergence that offers so much opportunities in what I think the World Economic Forum calls the fourth industrial revolution, or the digital economy, which is the next stage. So what is driving the new architecture is not so much what drove the old architecture, which caught itself in a position where it could go no further, was the technological shifting of the technological frontiers. The second aspect, of course, that has emerged and from which, to some extent, those of us who discuss this matter at the forum of which Carlos mentioned, we're looking at it from the economic and social perspective. And we are really arguing that the economic space within which we operate is too limited to expect the economies of scale and to be able to participate in the global economy competitively. Because you could talk about competitiveness, but if you don't have the economies of scale to compete in the global arena, it is only wishful thinking. So it is in that context we began to talk about the economic space. And we said the economic space cannot be changed by changing the boundaries of the existing organizations, especially the national boundaries. It has to be changed notwithstanding the boundaries, is what is called a borderless world. And it is in that context we said economic space was increased. So you have the technological convergence taking place as the first architecture, the first pillar of the new architecture. And then you have the search for economic space. Because without economic space, there can be no real competitive economy. Economic space can be brought about by internal dynamics, or it can be brought about by regional dynamics. And what we heard of in Brazil is a kind of internal dynamics. I rather suspect that is what is happening in China, and that is what is happening in India. Large countries are on their own going through a convergence process. They have the space of their own, that they don't need other spaces. Or they already, history have already given them that endowment. But for small countries, we don't have that endowment, so we have to create it as a result. And that is where the space argument comes in. And in that space argument comes all the arguments of the economic benefits of this. And what came out today, which I was not quite aware of, and I think this came out from Carlos' discussion, about development. And when I listened to Professor Byron spoke about all the different components of the integration processes and so forth, the end result of which was to bring about development. It was not integration in its own right that mattered. And many people who are integrationists become integrationists at the expense of development. And therefore we have to come to terms with what is the purpose of integration. It has to be development. And in the context of development, it has to sustain the resilience of the economy. Because underlying development is sustaining resilience. If the economy is not resilient, it will not have a sustained development path. And here I have to make the point that many integrationists think that integrationist is the product, but it's development is the product. And therefore the integration architecture may have to change to achieve the development process. So given those concepts that we have listened to here today and what we have seen, we see really in the new regionalism, a new architecture has to emerge that take into consideration the technological convergence that invariably is going to descend upon us, the space limitations that have already descended upon us, and the development requirements of resilience. Who have done this in the past, and who is well positioned to use this wiggle room concept for small economies? It was very, very interesting when I visited Southeast Asia some years ago, talking about integration, and to learn that in the agreement establishing the ASEAN community, the word integration was only used once. Symbolically, it meant something to me. A big document about the ASEAN community. They never saw themselves as having to integrate, because they never saw themselves as having to give up their boundaries and their civilization. But they saw themselves as having to work together in economic terms in particular, also in security terms to a lesser extent. That's a separate issue. But the word integration was very rarely mentioned in that ASEAN community. I was myself astonished, but I realized afterwards that the psychology behind the process of working together was not to integrate in the sense of having a common customs union and all that we are accustomed to in integration. It is really finding the right policy for the flow of capital, for the movement of people, for the transfer of technology, for the opening of markets. You could do all that without changing your boundaries or bothering about your boundaries, because those are other issues. And that is what brings about the development that we're talking about, and for the access to technology. So the model that we are searching for, derived from this concept, must now bring those things together. So the ASEAN community, I don't think it was deliberate, I think it just evolved. Their society has evolved and changed through evolvement. You see, a society that changes through evolvement is far more progressive than a society that's trying to retain an old order that is not working. And yesterday, I think the most provocative statement was made by a representative from the Caribbean Development Bank, when he alluded to the fact, in as diplomatic language as he could, that by 2050, the Caribbean will be among the lowest level of poor countries in the world. I don't think we should just ignore that statement. And he agreed in private discussions, thank you, in private discussions that they'll do a paper on it, which I will welcome. The reason I say that is that if you know in 2020, what we are doing is going to lead to that. You have to do something to change it from now. In the Latin American region, the only institution among all the integration movements that have begun to show light is the Pacific Alliance, which is the grouping of Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Colombia at the core. Trinidad and Tobago, incidentally, is an observer country. I was fortunate when I was foreign minister to make that decision, and it was strategic. But they are showing light because they are showing progress in development, the movement of capital, access, movement of access to technology, and the issues that are raised about, without having to bother with their boundaries. Of course, it requires a whole set of technical work. How do you have this flow of funds? You know, it's not a matter of you just do it like that. But the Pacific Alliance and those who are following integration movements in the Caribbean will see Mercosur always finding itself is always looking for some kind of rejuvenation. So what we are facing in the Caribbean is not only the Caribbean. All the integration models of the past are facing the same stresses and strains. The European Union is the most classic of all the examples. And they don't, I mean, it's a political manifestation of it. So all those old integration models, but the Pacific Alliance was only formed not too long ago, and was formed on the concept of a borderless world. And on the concept of an economic development part, a technological part, movement of capital, movement of people too. Although that's always a ticklish issue, but is a fundamental issue in the process. In the context of the Caribbean, when the Association of Caribbean States, and I'm so happy to see the Secretary General here with us this morning, as she was yesterday, of the Association of Caribbean States. When it was established, those who created that organization, coming from the Resident Commission report, Time for Action, and the thinking around that time, could not foresee the changes that we are facing today. That was 25 years ago. But it was created, not knowing exactly for what purpose, but the purpose may now arrive. And it is the only institution that is going to bring about the opportunity for a wider Caribbean space. And I will end with one last point, just to illustrate what I'm saying. And I will just refer to a specific example of the conduct of foreign policy. While I was while I was Minister of Foreign Affairs, this discussion began to take place in CARICOM, the same discussion. And that's what led to the Future of the Caribbean Forum. But more important than that, it led to the immediate expansion of CARICOM to include the Dominican Republic. Everything was set, not necessarily as member, but they were willing to get involved. Dominican Republic, in relative terms, is a large economy to the rest of the Caribbean. But the Caribbean position was that that was going to interfere with the integrity of CARICOM. I would like to explain what is the integrity of CARICOM if the integrity of CARICOM is not about development. if it has to exist in its own right, in spite of development, and face up to 2050 with it intact, but with development elusive, then I ask the question, what is the purpose of not designing the right architecture as opposed to the so-called puerile and sterile debate about inflation deficits? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Winston, for your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, this leaves us 30 minutes for discussion. And so what I'd like to do now is open up the floor for discussion. So we have some questions. I'll take, first of all, I'll take you, June, and then I'll take you, Ramesh. So just indicate your name and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you for very good presentations that have led to many, many questions that I have. I'm the student that you wouldn't like in your class. I always ask all the questions, and not easy ones either. But I'd like to start with the statement that it is really our history that determines our engagement with integration and convergence. And with that statement, I have a lot of questions for all of the panelists. And I'd like to start with Professor Dukaran. Why do you think that the theory of convergence and all of the convergence talks that we have not resonated or taken root in the Caribbean? I was there at that very first meeting that you had with heads in Guyana in 2011 when we had that retreat on convergence. Then you followed it up with the 2015 Futures Forum and a book and so on. But we still seem so wedded to integration theories that start with failure. The regional integration movement was spurred out of the West Indies Federation. We wanted to build something better. And I think it has, I have a slight difference. I think it has always been about development and not integration. And I don't believe either that the West Indies Federation was our failure. I've written on it, and I think that we were young countries moving into nationalism, and we had to feel our nationalism before we felt our regionalism. So I don't think it's our failure, I think it's a colonial failure. So why do you think that we still have not embraced convergence? And I think it starts with my first statement, that our engagement with both convergence and integration has to do with our history. And I would like to take that to the presentation on Brazil, where it is because of the history of Brazil that you have that convergence. Remember, Brazil is the only country in the region where the monarchy existed. I'm a Latin American historian also. And I know that the Portuguese monarchy moved to Brazil for more than 20 years in the 1880s. And because of that move, you had the investment in infrastructure, in universities, etc. And that is what spurred the convergence. But I still do not think that the convergence in Brazil has come as far as it should because of the racism of Brazil. Recalling, of course, that almost 5 million Africans went to Brazil, and they are still at the bottom of all social statistics, of all social and economic statistics. And so the convergence that we are seeing is not as, as great as it should be in Brazil. And I think it's taking a backward step currently. So I think that the data needs to be brought up to date. Then the same point that I made yesterday with regard to the information that we bring forward. Mr. Constantine, there is a lot of information on the OECS and the Gini coefficient and so on in Aldrich Henry Lee's work on the Gini coefficient. I have seen many presentations on it. And so I think that the issues with regard to inequality that you mentioned could get a great boost if you look at her work and you look at the Owen Arthur report on LDCs and MDCs, where he clearly articulates why there was a need and why there is a need to have that differentiation. So I think that, again, we are not getting all of the information that we need for us to be able to educate ourselves, to move ourselves out of that ignorance phase that the presenter was talking about. If we look at these things, the OECS is a model of convergence also, where you have the monetary convergence, where you have the fiscal convergence, where you have the social convergence. I mean, these economies have given an example to the rest of CARICOM. Why are we using CARICOM as a big word without pulling out the parts of CARICOM that work? And so these are some of the questions that I have, and I have more.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. So let me ask the panel to give some responses, and then Dave, I'll come to you right afterwards. So the panel. There's a microphone here if anyone wishes to engage Ambassador Suma.
Thank you for your question, and I agree with you. The fact that there was an established domestic government in the form of a monarchy, albeit, but nonetheless did give Brazil a step forward there and gave them the sort of vision of themselves that was lacking in many other colonialized countries. The convergence that I'm thinking of is the one that really started later, and I don't know if it was clear on that initial graph, but really the growth that starts post-World War II in the 1950s. And of course, Brazil has enormous, enormous gaps still. And I would never argue that they have accomplished everything that they could. In fact, I'm arguing the contrary, but the progress that has been made, I would say, does come from more or less what we've been talking about different types of convergence, and there have been backward steps along the way, clearly. I do think, however, that it's moving in the correct direction. Brazil is the eternal optimist in the world. They're always going to lead forward the correct step, and it doesn't always happen, but I've been sucked into that, and so I'm going to go along with it, and that they have taken finally the right step, and that there is a certain amount of unification of ideas of what should happen. Current events notwithstanding, I do view the future with rose-tinted glasses, for what it's worth.
All right. Anyone else responding? Yes, Colin.
Hi, thanks for your commentary. I take the point in the Gini coefficient, and just a quick response is that the reason I didn't rely on that type of work is because I was using top income shares as my measure of inequality. And just a quick comment on Gini coefficient. You see, it hides a lot of things. For example, in the slide on inequality in Brazil showed a decline in inequality based on Gini. But if you add tax data to that, the decline actually is not so steep, right? And Piketty is trying to re-estimate these things. So the Gini coefficient is a highly political measure. I mean, what does it say really? What matters as it relates to inequality is how rich the rich are, how poor the poor are, and only income shares can tell us that. So I use data that we have for income shares only. But I take the point, there is Gini coefficient estimates to OECS. I also take the point that they're a model in some dimensions as it relates to monetary union. We know that they perform better in terms of fiscal balances. That, of course, relates to the common currency, yeah? The thing is, though, they're a model, but not as it relates to building production capabilities. So we still need to talk about CARICOM a lot. So but I take the point generally. The whole idea of convergence, I do appreciate the presentations, and I was trying to place it within my own framing. And perhaps we need to think about convergence in terms of what dimensions. You know, I would emphasize we need convergence in terms of income distribution between countries to deal with the type of migration flows we get, or convergence in technological capabilities. Otherwise, we get polarization, economic performance, differences in business cycles, etc. So convergence is important, but we need to focus on what the convergence criteria should be. The classic framing now is convergence interest rates, convergence inflation rates, etc. Perhaps those are less fundamental asymmetries. At least that's what I would argue.
Okay. Dave, you had a question? Or someone else to respond? Oh, Winston, yes.
I think Dr. Sumer asked why it has not taken root. I can't answer that question deliberately, but I think you raised the issue of the politics of convergence, and we have not discussed that here, and that we can do that at some other time.
May I?
Right. So, yes. Go ahead.
Let me add one comment here. I think there are two dimensions to your question. So you can think of it as convergence of what you can do to accelerate it, and the other dimension is what convergence is, and so convergence is happening whether you like it or not, whether you push it or not. So it's a recognition of a process in motion, and therefore the politics play a part, of course, but in terms of the outcomes, there's not much that can be done to a process in motion.
Okay, Dave?
Don? Yes, thank you, Chair. You know, I'm very happy with the conference so far, and this session this morning just reinforced that. We had a lot of great discussions, points, new ideas. I think we are now beginning to kind of challenge some of our notions about how we should be proceeding, the strategy for development and so on. So it's in that context that I was very happy to hear all of the presenters, but in particular, Carlos has some very interesting ideas, and Winston and Colin. And for Colin in particular, I am glad that you actually have raised the point about the architecture for CARICOM. And you raised a very important point using the example of the European Union as to why, if we are following a model that is essentially based on the European Union, the outcomes have not been particularly good so far. And the kinds of turmoil the European Union is currently going through should offer us some red flags as to why our process here in the Caribbean might actually be something that is more workable in the long term, right? So, you know, I have a lot of students who have looked at these issues and so on. And one of the things that they have always pointed out is that, you know, the European Union have a much more hierarchical structure in terms of how they have the institutions, how they make decisions, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the Caribbean, in CARICOM, we have a much looser network-type analysis. And that model is much better at getting consensus, because the main challenge in the Caribbean is getting consensus. Whereas in the European Union, where you have this architecture, is better at making decisions. Okay, so they are better at making decisions. But if the architecture itself is going to generate results, which in the long run, as you rightly said, is going to divide, then we have to reconsider whether the approach that we have adopted in the Caribbean, specifically the CSME, is fit for purpose, and whether we might actually be much more wiser in the sense that this looser network arrangement is better in the long run in terms of trying to attain the objective of not integration, but of development, as Winston said. Because I think in the Caribbean and in the European Union in particular, if you listen to this course over a long period of time, you will see that people is almost a religion that integration and the European Union is a religion almost. And anybody who criticizes are deemed heretics, right? And they have lost, to me, they have lost the ultimate objective, which is development, right? So in that context, I think Colin's paper was very instructive. For Carlos, I think you're on to something. I could see in your presentation that you understand you understand implicitly this whole process of convergence that you're talking about. And I think you hit the nail on the head a little bit when you introduce the whole concept of a network. And as an economist, you should be familiar with network analysis and so on. The problem is that you are suggesting that the state in this new paradigm is not necessarily in the context of network analysis and using the terminology of network analysis. They are not nodes there. So in your network analysis, if the states are not nodes, and technology, all these processes like technology, security, environmental issues, and so on, if these are the defining characteristics of the network, how are you going to incorporate those kinds of differences in network analysis? And if you could achieve that, I think you'll come up with a very good way, excellent paper for publication and so on. All right? And finally, for Winston, I think you made a very important point, which is always kind of pushed into the background, which is that integration is a means to an end. You know, when we have economic discourses in this country, we talk about productivity, we talk about efficiency, we talk about competitiveness, and we lose sight of the fact that these things are means to an end. Sometimes, in losing sight of that reality, we want to relegate, for example, labor to a position where if we were to compete, the logic of competition, perfect competition, is that if we want to compete, we have to have our blue-collar workers have to have the same wage levels as people in China, in Bangladesh, and so on. If you want to take that to the logical conclusion, what are the implications for social welfare, and so on and so forth? So we have to be careful that we always keep at the forefront of our discussions that these things are means to an end. And if it is not serving the end, then we have to put them aside and come up with new ideas about how to get to that, our ultimate objective. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So let me ask the presenters whom he referenced to respond, and then I'll have a comment from you. Yeah. So let's get the three presenters whom he referenced. Yeah.
Dave, thanks for the comment. Let me answer it this way. There are different roads to Rome. I firmly believe that. It's not the end of the world having a Brexit, etc., etc. Now, it's fine if we in the region choose to have a fully integrated CSME. This is perfectly fine. What we have to be aware of, however, is that when we integrate different economies at significantly different levels of development, there will be forces for divergence. And we have to deal with this, and the only way to do it is with fiscal transfers. This is the debate in Europe, and this is why the United States functions without these type of crises, because they have that. Now, it's also fine for Germany to say, we don't want to be a transfer union. It's also fine for Jamaica or Caribbean to say, we don't want that type of political arrangement. But then we can't have a fully functional CSME. This is the thing. Why does the OECS work fine? Because they have similar characteristics, and integration makes sense there. Could you imagine integrating Guyana with the OECS and share a common currency? I promise you the OECS would not look like such a success story anymore. All right? Everything is going to pull towards Guyana for all the obvious reasons. Migration flows, investment, etc. It gets worse if you were to add a real core country like Trinidad or Jamaica to the OECS and a common currency. Right? So it's about choices. We need to be aware of the trade-offs. As it relates to looser arrangements, well, we have a looser arrangement, I think, only because we can't find consensus on the way towards the European model, right? It's a halfway house. Yeah, which might be a blessing in disguise, right? So I take the point.
Carlos?
Yeah, very quickly. Two comments. One is to your point of nodes. I was referring really to the unit of analysis, and in that context, thinking that the unit of analysis as a country, which is where we stand now, is not useful. So I was thinking about economic space, and now you make me think of hyperplanes, and you put my brain into a different. So in different hyperplanes, nodes would be formed by governments, definitely, but the economic space may not. So there would be nodes in which different countries are in the same hyperspace. That's perhaps what I'm trying to say in confusion, because it's just occurring to me thanks to you. The second comment, I think, which is, I see in our own words, in our own rhetoric, I see that we are ourselves confused by the concept of convergence, because from one end you hear convergence as a almost like as a supply side, right? We talk about convergence in the context of institutions such as like the European Union or CARICOM or something else. And on the other hand, you hear convergence in the context of a description of a process that is, and in understanding that process with rules of the change in architectures become obsolete, and as they do become obsolete, of course they cannot deliver the promised outputs because they are working for a reality that does not work. So I think at least from my perspective, one of the lessons learned of these conversations, there are many, but one is how we use the word and what we mean by it. Because if we use it meaning all these different things, we need to sit down and clarify when we mean convergence as the meaning of convergence in the traditional sense, and when we mean convergence in the sense of a new paradigm of a description of a process in motion based on networks and transactions and things like that.
Winston?
I just want to add to what Carlos said by saying that perhaps for clarity of concept and for identification of strategic measures, it might be necessary to have a wide-ranging dialogue on the context of informed views. And institutions like the ACS, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank, ECLAC, who is well represented here from Washington, but not from Port of Spain, could get together and design some clarity on the issues for the purposes of public policy. And my own feeling is that the reason why it didn't get as far as it could have got is because of the absence of clarity. And that could only come by some kind of study of some sort.
Jessica, you had, you wanted to? No, okay, Jessica.
I think this is, okay, I just wanted to put in a couple of comments. First of all, no, I am not an economist. I've studied integration theory, but more from a political, institutional, and also political economy perspective. Actually, I think that a political economy approach is probably just as well suited as an purely economic approach to trying to understand phenomena such as integration in the Caribbean context. Now, there is a difference between integration and cooperation, at least in integration theory. Regional integration, as it is understood amongst many scholars of integration, is a process that may proceed in stages, but ultimately there is some level of translating sovereignty to a level above the state, of having some supranational processes where some of the national sovereignty is merged into something approaching a regional sovereignty. It does not have to be all-encompassing, but that is what is usually understood by the term integration. The looser term, cooperation, means facilitating a range of transnational areas of cooperation, whether it is, and usually this means development cooperation across a range of sectoral areas. I find that we are very loosely collapsing these two concepts, which are essentially a bit different. In the case of the Caribbean, Caribbean countries, there is a lot of cooperation, and there is a much more minimal level of formal integration. Now, Dave, I wanted to, it's okay, I'll speak generally. I wanted to refer to something that Dave said a while ago about the fact that loose consensus and cooperation has worked very well for us, up to a point. But I think that our issues, we have had major challenges with implementation of decisions that we have made for decades, and we just have not gotten anywhere near putting them into practice. And there is an importance to institutions. I don't think that all, I think that the CSME that was thought up was probably wildly overambitious. But our institutions are important. Look at the rulings of the CCJ, rulings that embrace the rights of individual Caribbean citizens, their freedom of mobility, the rulings of other courts in the Caribbean. One of the most significant juridical rulings was taken in the context of Barbadian elections in 2017, when large numbers of Caribbean citizens are living in other countries. Some of them are Commonwealth citizens. Most of our constitutions, most of the Commonwealth Caribbean constitutions have provisions relating to the rights of other Commonwealth citizens to attain citizenship or to have voting rights in those jurisdictions after a number of years. And in the Barbadian elections in 2017, a group of Commonwealth Caribbean citizens brought a case against the Barbadian Electoral Commission, and they got the rights to vote in Barbadian elections, which was very interesting in terms of how it makes us start thinking about citizenship and what citizenship means, may mean in the regional context, and where our formal regional institutions fit into that, in a context where we say regional mobility is important. Institutions are important also. We have an agreement on contingent rights, which is now being addressed. There is a much older agreement in CARICOM, dating back to 1997, about the portability of one's social security rights. These are important considerations. I am from St. Kitts and Nevis. I have worked much longer in Jamaica and in Trinidad now, almost 30 years, than I have worked in St. Kitts and Nevis. So what happens to my social security rights? Right? These are issues for many, many people in this region. So if regionalism is to have any concrete value to our citizens, if we want people, whatever we call them, skilled, or we have these strange names for skilled and unskilled, but people, if we are talking about development, if we are talking about human development, It is the institutions which have a responsibility to guarantee people's access to these rights, particularly their social and economic rights in the regional space. Also, finally, institutions are important for the regulation at the regional level of certain sectors. Yesterday in the discussion, I referred to the case of the financial services sector and the fact that in 2009, the crash of some insurance and banking institutions in the region wiped out the GDP. I know for the OECS countries, it wiped out a considerable part of the GDP of those countries. And it brought home to us the fact that our financial services sector, which is one of the most rapidly growing sectors in the region and one that really promotes growth, was not sufficiently regulated and could be as much of a factor for destruction as it could be a factor for growth. So when we're speaking about cooperation or integration, we need to remember that institutions are important.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. And on that note, that will be the last word. It is now 12 noon, which is the advertised time to end this panel. So the panel has come to an end. I want to thank all the presenters. Could you join me in thanking the presenters? And the program says lunch is between 12 noon and 1:30, so I presume the next item on the agenda is lunch. Thank you very much.